Today we are talking about the Ra buff, and to some degree we're talking about the implications of that buff that come with it for the game overall. But let's dig into that a little deeper and start with the actual buff, more specifically the reasoning for the buff. This is important as many players were quite surprised with this buff being made, or Ra being buffed in general, as he was generally considered in a very good place. Hi-Risk's statement was as follows. Ra's performance stats have been continually declining through the second half of Season 4. The god definitely brings unique tools to the table in his abilities to heal his entire team and snipe enemy players from long range. However, his damage output is at an all-time low, so we are increasing his lowest damaging ability. This ability creates a good amount of risk if Ra wants to use it aggressively and will give Ra players more flexibility in their playstyle and give them higher damage potential. The ability in question here is Divine Light. Now, a very interesting thing to note here is that Hi-Risk states that Ra's damage output is at an all-time low. And that implies one thing, that Hi-Risk has tracked his overall damage numbers throughout the season, which I think is interesting. If they're doing that for all gods, it gives you a pretty clear picture of at least one of the statistics that Hi-Risk uses for their buffing or nerfing decisions, as they will see the overall damage output of the gods. Now, the damage output of Ra has declined for an obvious reason, at least partially, and that is that we see more tanky items on most gods. That means he will simply be less able to put out damage, and even if he puts out damage, the kill potential is lower, and lower kill potential leads to less snowballing or less items that you get over the enemy, which also leads to lower damage even if we ignore the mitigated damage. The actual buff is as follows. Increase the base damage of Divine Light from 60 to 220 to 70 to 270, meaning an extra 10 base damage per rank of the ability. Additionally, increase the magical power from 40% to 55%. Also, reduce mana cost from 60 to 100 to 60 to 80, so 5 less per rank here. That overall means 50 extra base damage, 15% more scaling for 20 less mana at max rank. That's a pretty good buff. At the same time, we all know how Ra is typically used and how he typically positions in fights, and as such, Divine Light doesn't find the biggest usage quite often, because you're more towards the backline, you're more playing it a little bit safe and have others do the frontline work, and Divine Light is really mostly a peel when the enemy engages on you. With multiple frontliners being quite common, you will be engaged on a lot, and it's very helpful to have some sort of tool to keep them away. And they won't really care about a little bit of extra damage, so it's usually something that will most likely rather hit someone like an assassin. Now, assassins are probably not the class that you want to hit at the moment, because they're really not in the best place, along with the mages. That's a bit unfortunate in regards to this buff, but at the same time I wouldn't think it's a major issue. Ra's Divine Light actually felt a little bit underwhelming in comparison to his other abilities. It was not very punishing at all to just run straight into him and even ignore the fact that you're gonna get blinded and just go for the damage, because quite often he would still pretty much die when the ability goes off. As such, I don't believe this buff is gonna make or break the character. We're not suddenly gonna dive into minion waves with Divine Light on level 1. Or only play Bruiser Ra to get the maximum damage out of Divine Light. That's not what's gonna happen. But what we can say from these changes is that we see some interesting development over time. A god that was balanced, or considered balanced at least by most, falls off in the meta. And whenever that happens, people kinda see that as something called power creep. Now, power creep is something that in most MOBAs exists to at least some degree. Power creep essentially means that if you keep releasing stronger and stronger characters into a game, then you will eventually come to a point where all the old characters that have other numbers feel weak, feel just not up to the meta anymore, and have to be buffed. So you basically have this constant cycle of having newer, stronger gods in SMITE theoretically, and then having to buff everyone else because they can't keep up with them anymore. And I do not believe that that's a wrong statement in itself. I do not believe that power creep doesn't exist, because there are cases of power creep that we have seen in the past. But I am not the one to scream power creep the moment I see a buff like this at this point anymore. I used to think very much like that. I used to believe that power creep is something that is very common and is something that happens within SMITE all the time. But the more I analyze the game, the more I look behind the numbers, the more I feel like there is a fair bit more at play here. The same thing not only happened to Ra, but also, for example, Agni, and you have other gods that kind of fall off a little bit, like think a Willish, without any actual changes to them. What is often ignored in that context is that there are still changes to the game. The changes don't only affect other gods, direct god changes obviously have an impact too, but things like the meta too. The meta can literally skyrocket a certain character if a certain strategy is found to the highest tiers from average tier or lower than that, and they can be much more effective, and that can happen without any changes just through discovering something. Likewise, the meta can establish completely new or different build strategies that will counter out certain characters more than others. Say for example that Magi's Blessing would suddenly become standard on everyone again, be it through a buff or through other means of it being more effective, and we suddenly see our Kwang dropping off in the meta. Would that be because the new powerful mages got released into SMITE? No, this would only be because Magi's Blessing is extremely effective against our Kwang, who needs a way to get his ultimate off and doesn't have any other form of CC, so we'll have to utilize that one option. And as such, anyone building Magi's Blessing would already counter him to some degree that way. That will lead to our Kwang eventually, if the meta lasts long enough, requiring some sorts of buffs in order to compensate for that, in order to make him effective in that meta as well, at least to some degree. He doesn't have to be the best god, but he would probably be completely out of the meta if that happened. What could happen in return is that his basic attack damage gets buffed, his dragons get buffed or something, so he can find a new niche as a basic attack assassin, and that way compensate for the fact that his ult will not be effective in most situations and the burst combo doesn't really work as before. Something else to keep in mind is how, for example, an item meta can affect the damage output of certain characters. And I'm not talking about tanky frontliners soaking up more damage here, but think for example of a more defense-oriented meta where mages build something like Height of the Urchin, any tanky item that is standard in their build at some point, or ADCs do that or whoever, it doesn't really matter. In those metas, gods that have higher base damage values will usually have a benefit over those with higher scaling damage. Why? Because you have one less power item to scale with. As such, you will benefit from having base damage values that don't depend on the power items. Or, the other way around, we could have a meta where penetration items are not as effective as power items, or not as used, because power items are favored for whatever reason, because they're just stronger at that point. That would mean that characters that benefit more from their base damage values, or have higher base damage values, will kind of fall off in the meta, because if you have high base damage values, you want to have penetration to get those base damage values through, and not so much power, which benefits scaling characters much better. Any new item introduction or any other god that was previously not in the meta rising to the top without any item changes can always change the place of a god in the meta. And if we, for example, have gods like Osiris or Cuchulainn who have very good means of sticking to the targets relatively high in the meta, then a god like Ra will naturally struggle. Those gods can be in his face at all times, they have ways of getting back to him if he gets away, and they can lock him down in place long enough in order to deal massive amounts of damage to him and have the team collapse on them. Obviously, in a situation like that, he's not gonna do too well. I will say that I do believe there is power creep in SMITE though, often in other regards. One thing that we see also with this Ra change here is the mana cost changes. Newer mages or newer gods in general have lower mana cost than older ones. We've seen this with Sobek and Artemis and various other older gods that had their mana cost reduced because they were just not the current standard anymore. Other gods were just able to clear much more mana effectively or use their escapes or whatever, and that's something that's been lowered over time, and gods are gradually being adjusted in this regard. Not the biggest, most dramatic change in my eyes at least, because I'm okay with the mana cost being lower and being able to use a few more abilities, but it's a change that we definitely see. Another change that I personally am less happy about is the amount of mobility. Old gods typically weren't that mobile, which is why we saw quite a few gods being a lot more successful in earlier seasons. Think for example of Bakasura or Kali. With our newer gods, we very often see them have at least some sort of escape, even if it's just a short range immunity frame like Discordia does in her leap, or something with a wind-up like Radiant has. It's still a lot more effective than what gods used to have to get away, which is more things like Ra's Divine Light, if they had mobility. And that is something that I believe becomes problematic over time. There's not enough counters to mobility other than having mobility yourself in the game, and those guards who counter it aren't even that effective at the moment, while we see certain guards, especially basic attack assassins that have to be close to the target, just falling off in the meta heavily because they can't really stick to anyone when everyone can just jump away. As somebody who enjoys basic attack assassins the most, that's especially unfortunate for me, but obviously there's a certain personal bias to that as well. In conclusion, I don't think we should flinch at every buff that gets made to characters which we thought were perfectly balanced, and sometimes the changes can be very justified, especially when there's stats we don't have insight into. At the same time, power creep shouldn't be a laughed at or frowned upon topic. It is something that should be discussed and to some degree being recognized as also existent in SMITE. And with that, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope this was entertaining or informative. If you're not subscribed yet, feel free to click the sub button, maybe the bell. It really helps me out. And it gives you the chance to win some codes in the description down below from time to time. See you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth, out.